It began in the winter of 1944, the coldest, most bitter season Europe had seen in decades. Snow blanketed the Ardennes forest, and visibility was low. The roads were slick. The wind cut through coats like knives, and every breath turned to ice before it reached the ground. American soldiers huddled near their fires, unaware that just beyond the tree line, the enemy was preparing one of the boldest and strangest operations of the entire war. The Allies had been pushing deeper into Nazi-occupied Europe since D-Day. It looked like the war was finally turning in their favor. But Adolf Hitler had one last desperate gamble up his sleeve, a counteroffensive that would try to split the Allied lines and drive straight to the port of Antwerp. If it worked, it could force the Allies to negotiate peace on Germany's terms. The plan would come to be known as the Battle of the Bulge, and hidden within it was a smaller, darker operation, one that almost sounded like something from a spy movie. It was called Operation Greif, led by one of Hitler's most daring commanders, Otto Skorzeny. Skorzeny was no ordinary officer. He was tall, scar-faced, and had a reputation for pulling off the impossible. He had already rescued Mussolini from captivity in a dramatic glider raid. Hitler called him his favorite commando. And now, Skorzeny was tasked with something even more audacious: to infiltrate the American lines using German soldiers disguised as U.S. troops. Imagine it. German agents dressed in American uniforms, speaking English, driving captured U.S. jeeps, carrying forged papers, and even mimicking American slang. Their mission was to sneak behind Allied lines, spread confusion, misdirect convoys, sabotage communication, and turn the battlefield into chaos. The idea seemed impossible, and yet, in the confusion of war, it might just work. To carry it out, Skorzeny formed a special unit called the 150th Panzer Brigade, a force of hand-picked men who could speak fluent English, preferably with an American accent. He scoured POW camps and intelligence units, searching for anyone who had lived in the United States or had a believable American voice. But finding such men wasn't easy. Out of thousands of German soldiers, only a few dozen could pass for Americans even remotely. Still, Skorzeny pushed ahead. He gathered stolen Allied uniforms, captured jeeps, and forged identification papers. Mechanics repainted German vehicles to resemble American ones. Even road signs were faked. They planned to replace real ones with false directions to send Allied troops the wrong way. The operation was daring, but it was also dangerous. According to the laws of war, any soldier caught wearing the enemy's uniform could be executed as a spy. Skorzeny's men knew that if they were captured, there would be no mercy. Yet they volunteered anyway, believing in the thrill of the mission and the loyalty to their commander. December 16th, 1944, the Battle of the Bulge began. Under cover of darkness and snow, German tanks thundered into the Ardennes. Artillery shattered the silence, and American lines buckled under surprise assault. Amid the chaos, the disguised German infiltrators slipped through, blending into retreating U.S. forces. At first, no one suspected a thing. The roads were crowded with confused, exhausted soldiers. Units were scattered, communications were broken, and orders were unclear. Amid the fog of war, a few unfamiliar faces didn't stand out. The infiltrators started their work, turning road signs, giving false directions, and spreading rumors that American lines had collapsed. Convoys went the wrong way. Supplies ended up in German hands. Some bridges were blown up by American engineers who were anything but. Panic began to spread among Allied troops. Reports started trickling in. Strange behavior among supposed GIs, odd accents, and men who didn't seem quite right. One officer swore that a group of MPs had given him incorrect directions. Another claimed his own men had arrested an American who didn't know the name of the Chicago Cubs manager. It sounded absurd at first. Americans who didn't know baseball? But in wartime, absurdity could mean danger. Rumors began to swirl. German spies were wearing American uniforms, operating behind the lines, sabotaging everything they could touch. Soldiers began to look suspiciously at one another. Who could be trusted? Who was real and who was an imposter? In some cases, paranoia reached fever pitch. At checkpoints, MPs stopped every jeep, interrogating drivers with odd, spontaneous questions. Who won the World Series? What's the capital of Illinois? What's the name of Roosevelt's dog? The logic was simple. A real American would know. A German, no matter how well-trained, would hesitate. Even for a split second, and that hesitation could mean everything. The result was chaos, but this time among the Americans themselves. Generals were stopped and questioned by their own men. One story even tells of General Omar Bradley himself being briefly detained because a nervous MP wasn't convinced he was who he claimed to be. The paranoia spread faster than the infiltrators themselves. And while only a few dozen of Skorzeny's men actually made it behind Allied lines, their psychological impact was massive. They had managed to weaponize fear and confusion, exactly what Skorzeny had planned. But soon, the tide began to turn. American counterintelligence grew sharper, and the questioning got more creative. A simple baseball test, questions about the most American of sports, started catching the imposters off guard. It was clever, unexpected, and devastatingly effective. But how did it actually happen? How did a group of German infiltrators in stolen uniforms nearly throw the U.S. Army into disarray? And how did a baseball question finally expose them? That story, bizarre, thrilling, and very real, was about to unfold in the frozen forests of Belgium, where deception met determination, and one of the strangest chapters of World War II came to life. The cold morning mist hung low over the Ardennes as the infiltrators moved out. Jeep engines hummed softly through the fog, tires crunching over frozen snow. To anyone watching from a distance, they looked like ordinary GIs, worn jackets, helmets with fading paint, rifles slung over their shoulders. But beneath those layers of khaki and wool, the men were German commandos, specially trained, fluent in English, and armed not with heavy weapons, but with lies. They slipped through American checkpoints with forged passes, carrying orders stamped top secret, and marked with real Allied insignias. Some even wore dog tags taken from American corpses. When questioned, they spoke casually, throwing in bits of slang, buddy, okay pal, you bet, phrases they had practiced for weeks. The deception worked frighteningly well. One team redirected an entire U.S. convoy down the wrong road, sending hundreds of vehicles straight toward German artillery positions. Another replaced signposts, twisting arrows so that Bastogne pointed east instead of west. Supply trucks were delayed, tanks went missing, and soldiers found themselves lost in territory they thought was safe. In a matter of hours, the battlefield had turned into a maze of confusion. Skorzeny's commandos operated like ghosts, silent, invisible, and impossible to trace. Their orders were clear: spread chaos, not fire. Most of them avoided combat altogether, preferring stealth and sabotage. They cut communication lines, planted false mines, and whispered misinformation to anyone who would listen. Some even claimed that Field Marshal Montgomery had been killed, or that German tanks were already behind Allied headquarters. These rumors spread like wildfire. Radios crackled with uncertainty. Commanders doubted their own intelligence reports. Soldiers began to suspect everyone, even their own officers. In the midst of this psychological storm, the real American military police were scrambling to regain control. Rumors reached them that Germans were masquerading as GIs. At first, it sounded absurd, a wartime fairy tale. But soon, evidence started piling up. One suspicious soldier was caught with a map showing German positions. Another had a pack of cigarettes labeled in German instead of English. A third, when asked where he was from, hesitated before blurting out, Brooklyn, but pronounced it like Brooklyn. The MPs realized they had a serious problem on their hands. Anyone could be the enemy, and the only way to find them was through questions that no foreigner could fake. At checkpoints across Belgium, soldiers were now stopped, searched, and interrogated with bizarre, rapid-fire questions. Who won the World Series last year? What's the capital of Illinois? Who's Mickey Mouse's girlfriend? What's the color of a stop sign? These weren't military questions. They were cultural, deeply American, the kind of things a soldier from Kansas or Ohio would know instantly, but a German would never anticipate. It became known as the baseball test, though it went far beyond baseball. It was a test of identity, one that no amount of disguise could truly overcome. The atmosphere grew tense. Soldiers who had fought side by side for months now eyed each other suspiciously. A wrong answer could get a man arrested, or worse. In one famous incident, an American officer was detained for half an hour because he couldn't remember the name of the New York Yankees shortstop. Another soldier, genuinely from Wisconsin, was thrown in a jeep at gunpoint because he mispronounced the capital of Vermont. It wasn't until he produced his paybook that they finally let him go. Even generals weren't immune. General Omar Bradley himself was once stopped by MPs who demanded to know who won the World Series. He paused for a moment, long enough for the guards to grow nervous, before correctly answering, the St. Louis Cardinals. Only then did they salute and let him pass. The paranoia was spreading almost as fast as the Germans themselves. Skorzeny's men had achieved something remarkable. With only a few dozen infiltrators, they had caused mass distrust among tens of thousands of Allied soldiers. But their luck couldn't last forever. On December 18th, one of the disguised teams was stopped near Malmedy. An alert MP noticed that one of the supposed Americans had his boots laced in a distinctly German fashion, crisscrossed from the outside in. That tiny detail sparked suspicion. When questioned, the men grew nervous. Their English faltered. Within minutes, they were arrested. A search of their jeep uncovered German weapons, forge passes, and a radio tuned to a Luftwaffe frequency. Interrogations followed, harsh, relentless, and urgent. Under pressure, several of the captured infiltrators revealed the truth. They confessed to being part of Otto Skorzeny's secret commando unit, sent to disrupt Allied operations behind the lines. They gave names, objectives, and details of how they'd been trained. The revelation hit Allied command like a thunderclap. Skorzeny's name immediately appeared on the Allies' most wanted list. Rumors spread that he was personally leading the infiltrations, disguised as an American general. Every tall officer with a scar was suddenly a suspect. At one point, a U.S. checkpoint reportedly detained every officer taller than 6 feet, just in case. It was chaos, a kind of madness that spread far beyond the battlefield. And yet, in a twisted way, the operation was a success, not because it turned the tide of the battle, but because it terrified the Allied forces into overreacting. Entire columns were delayed for hours at checkpoints. Military traffic jammed icy roads. Commanders hesitated to issue orders until every messenger had been verified. Time, the most precious resource in war, was slipping away. In total, about 150 men participated in Operation Greif, but only around 2 dozen ever managed to get behind American lines. Yet the psychological damage was enormous, out of all proportion to their numbers. Still, the infiltrators paid a heavy price. Those who were captured were treated as spies under the laws of war. They faced swift courts-martial and firing squads. Several were executed, shot by American soldiers they had almost fooled. Skorzeny himself, however, vanished back behind German lines. To the Americans, he became a ghost, the mysterious, scar-faced mastermind who had dared invade their ranks dressed in their own uniform. As the Battle of the Bulge raged on, Allied intelligence made one thing clear. Any soldier caught in enemy uniform would be shown no mercy. It was a brutal but necessary warning. Yet, for Skorzeny, the mission wasn't over. He had planted a seed, a deep sense of mistrust that would continue to ripple through the ranks for days. And though the German offensive would ultimately fail, his strange, daring infiltration became a legend of psychological warfare. Proof that sometimes confusion could be deadlier than bullets. The Americans had learned a lesson they would never forget. In the fog of war, identity can be as powerful a weapon as any rifle. And the most unlikely weapon of all, a simple question about baseball, had turned the tide of deception. But the story didn't end there. As the Allies pushed back and recaptured lost ground, they found clues, documents, and confessions that revealed just how close Skorzeny's plan had come to working. And when the dust settled, the fate of those captured infiltrators and their enigmatic leader took a turn no one expected. By the first days of January 1945, the snow-covered battlefields of Belgium had become silent again, the thunder of artillery replaced by the moaning wind over frozen corpses and shattered vehicles. The Battle of the Bulge was coming to an end. Hitler's grand counteroffensive had failed, and his armies were retreating once more into Germany. But among the stories of bravery and tragedy, one stood out as a legend whispered around campfires. The tale of the German infiltrators who had walked among American soldiers, speaking their language, wearing their uniforms, and almost turned the tide of war with nothing but deception. As Allied forces pushed the Germans back, more of Skorzeny's men were captured. Each one had a story. How they'd been trained in English slang, drilled to imitate American mannerisms, and prepared to die in enemy clothing. Some had carried out their missions. Others never made it past the front lines. A few surrendered voluntarily when they realized how hopeless their position had become. For the Americans who interrogated them, it was almost surreal. Men who looked like them, spoke like them, yet fought for the other side. Many of the captured infiltrators were young, barely in their 20s. When asked why they volunteered for such a suicidal assignment, their answers varied: loyalty, duty, pride, or simply the thrill of being part of something extraordinary. But now, the extraordinary had turned into a death sentence. Under the Hague Convention, wearing an enemy uniform during combat was considered espionage, punishable by death. The captured Germans were court-martialed quickly. Several were executed by firing squad. The rest were sent to POW camps, where they remained until the war's end. Meanwhile, the name Otto Skorzeny spread through Allied intelligence like wildfire. To some, he was a criminal mastermind, Hitler's favorite commando, a man who had dared to mock the rules of war. To others, even among the Allies, there was a grudging admiration for his audacity. Few men could orchestrate such an operation and live to tell about it. In the spring of 1945, as Berlin burned and the Third Reich collapsed, Skorzeny managed to evade capture for months. He was finally arrested by American troops in Austria, tired but unbroken. When they brought him in, his captors noted the faint scar running down his cheek, the same one that had made him infamous. Now, the man who had once disguised his soldiers as Americans would stand trial before Americans. In 1947, Otto Skorzeny was brought before a U.S. military tribunal in Dachau. The charge: violating the laws of war by ordering his men to fight in enemy uniforms. The evidence seemed overwhelming. Witnesses described his orders, the captured disguises, the forged papers. There was no denying what had happened. Yet Skorzeny's defense was clever and shockingly persuasive. He argued that his men had worn American uniforms only for infiltration and deception, not for direct combat. Once fighting began, they changed back into German uniforms, or at least attempted to. He even cited examples from Allied history, British commandos during earlier raids, who had worn enemy clothing for surprise attacks. If the Allies had done it, how could it be a war crime for him? Then came the twist no one expected. An American officer, called as a witness, confirmed that Allied commandos had indeed used enemy uniforms for certain operations. The courtroom fell silent. The judges deliberated for days. In the end, Otto Skorzeny was acquitted. He walked out of the courtroom a free man. The decision sparked outrage among many. How could a man who had orchestrated one of the most deceptive missions of the war walk free? But others saw the ruling as a grim acknowledgement of an uncomfortable truth, that in war, deception was a weapon used by all sides. After his release, Skorzeny didn't vanish. He built a new life, first in Spain, under protection of Francisco Franco, then later in Argentina. Rumors followed him everywhere. That he helped former Nazis escape through secret routes to South America, that he worked as a military advisor to foreign governments, even that he served as a bodyguard to controversial figures during the Cold War. Whether these stories were true or not, one thing was certain. Otto Skorzeny had become a legend, both feared and admired. But the legacy of Operation Greif went far beyond one man's story. For the Allies, it was a haunting reminder of how fragile trust could be in wartime. A few men with fluent English and stolen uniforms had thrown entire divisions into suspicion. Soldiers began to realize that the enemy wasn't always across the line. Sometimes, he could be standing right next to you. In the months after the war, historians and intelligence officers studied Operation Greif carefully. They realized it was one of the earliest examples of psychological warfare, an operation designed not to destroy armies, but to infect minds with doubt and confusion. It was deception elevated to an art form. And yet, despite its cleverness, it hadn't changed the outcome of the war. The Battle of the Bulge ended in a crushing German defeat. The Allies held their lines, regrouped, and pushed back. The price had been terrible. Tens of thousands dead, wounded, or captured. But the German offensive had failed to achieve its goal. Still, the echoes of that strange deception lingered. In the decade that followed, veterans told the story again and again. How they'd been stopped by nervous MPs, asked who won the World Series, or who Mickey Mouse's girlfriend was. Some laughed about it years later. Others admitted that, for a while, they truly didn't know who to trust. The baseball question became a symbol, a small but brilliant moment of American ingenuity in the face of fear. And perhaps that's what makes this story so unforgettable. It wasn't about tanks or bombs or generals. It was about identity, the power of language, culture, and the small details that define who we are. For the Germans, it was a lesson in the limits of deception. For the Americans, it was a reminder that victory sometimes depends not just on strength, but on understanding what makes you unique. By the time the war ended in 1945, Operation Greif had already become a myth, a tale whispered in barracks and training schools, studied by intelligence officers and psychologists alike. It was a story of fear and cunning, of uniforms and accents, of men who blurred the line between soldier and spy. And all of it, the paranoia, the interrogations, the chaos, could be traced back to a handful of German soldiers in stolen jackets, driving captured jeeps through the fog of war, pretending to be Americans. They had nearly succeeded. But in the end, they were undone by something profoundly simple, a question about baseball. Because when the world falls into madness, when friends and enemies start to look the same, sometimes it's the smallest, most human details that reveal the truth. A name, an accent, a memory of a game back home. That was the difference between life and death in the winter of 1944, when men who looked like Americans were anything but, and a simple question became the sharpest weapon of all.